on law and digital technology, focused also on artificial intelligence at the University of Amsterdam, the Netherlands as well. Thank you once again for accepting our invitation. Besides being a professor at the University of Amsterdam, she's also engaged in many projects, both research and beyond, related to topics of ethical and public policy challenges related to algorithms, especially in the media sphere, but also more generally in consumer markets, in political campaigning, also in healthcare sector, for example. So it's a very impressive and broad range of areas. Professor Helberger is also a member of the expert committee on artificial intelligence and human rights at the Council of Europe, and has been collaborating with many different organizations, including consumer organizations. And from what I understand, today's presentation is going to be related to one of such recent studies, which has been co-authored for the European Consumer Organization BEUC, which was on structural asymmetries and in the digital markets. And the topic of the presentation today is going to be on profiling, consumer vulnerability, and unfair commercial practices. So thank you again for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you, Frederick, for making the link to a very elegant link to my presentation. And I start sharing my screen. So I trust you can see all my screen. Then let's get started. So you've been already touching upon it. Price discrimination, of course, is also a result of this move to more data-driven marketing practices in our digital marketplace, where our online behavior is essentially registered 24/7. Every step in our consumer journey is monitored. We are submitted to a constant stream of A/B testing and interventions to optimize the systems, to optimize the price, and a lot of data, and a very smart web of speakers and intelligent fridges and in-store applications and apps track everything we do. And all this data feeds into the creation of virtual representations of our so-called persuasion profiles, which can be used, for example, for price differentiation or discrimination, or for selling products, services, and consumers, and very sophisticated advertising strategy. Strategies that can range from contextual advertising, making sure that you see an advertising about a journey next to an article describing the pleasures of traveling, but also strategies that are more targeted on age or gender, or even more finely grained targeting. For example, matching your demographic characteristics of your observed behavior with an advertisement. Two very fine-grained forms of psychographic targeting, where based on what you do online, for example, on the social media, advertisers get, or marketeers get, an idea of what your emotions are, what your concerns are, what your biases are, and use that to provide, to optimize advertising strategies or pricing strategies. And the overall objective of all these practices is to render consumers receptive to data-driven marketing strategies. The question is, what does the law to protect the consumer? And Frederick already told us about non-discrimination law. I would like to revisit another area of law with you, which is unfair commercial practice law. And in that context, I would especially like to speak about the notion of consumer vulnerability, and or as we coin it, digital vulnerability. And in my next 15 minutes, I would like to argue that we need to rethink the concept of consumer vulnerability. And so far, consumer vulnerability has been used to single out particular groups in society that are less able to protect themselves, and because of that, deserve higher specific attention under unfair commercial practice law: disabled, children, elderly. I will argue that digital vulnerability has become essentially a universal state of defenseless and susceptibility to persuasion and data-driven segmentation. ignoring the fact that each of us is potentially vulnerable to unfair data practices or pricing strategies will create a very real risk of underestimating the structural power asymmetries that the digital turn has created and will perpetuate. The findings that I present to you, as indeed, as Agnieszka already indicated, are based on a study that we just concluded for Buke, together with Professor Hans Miklix, Marijn Sachs, and Jonas Stricherts here. Yeah, I would like to present you some findings of the study. And the idea of the study is to inform the activities of Buke in this space, and also help to inform, of course, law and policy making, decision making at the European level. But let me start from the beginning. I'm not sure who of you is familiar with unfair commercial practice law. If not, I'll give you a very, very brief deep dive into unfair commercial practice law. The goal is to protect consumers from misleading practices, from unfair manipulation and limitations of the autonomous choice making, either through not providing them the information they need to make informed decisions, or to exercise pressure in the form of aggressive practices or undue influence. Unfair commercial practice law can have an important role in assessing the fairness of data-driven marketing practices. For example, the European Commission, in its guidance on the application of the Unfair Commercial Practice Directive, explicitly stated that personalized pricing or marketing could be combined with an unfair commercial practices and be in breach of unfair commercial practice law. For example, if the information that is gathered through profiling is used to pressure you into a decision. Just imagine you are on one of these booking sites, your time is running up, and a site falsely claims that there are only a few tickets left because they know that you really need this plane ticket, or are fed up with being locked down and really need to travel. A growing body of literature also argues that the provision of aggressive practices could actually address situations in which companies exploit these persuasion profiles to undermine your cognitive internal processes of autonomous decision-making, or exercise influence about the way you make decisions, for example, by influencing your emotions. A central element in assessing the fairness of any commercial practice is the underlying idea of the consumer. Who is it we're talking about? Is this consumer an average consumer? This is the European champion ideal of the consumer, a consumer who is reasonably well-informed, observant, and circumspect, and essentially can be expected to protect herself if she is only provided with right information. Or is it a vulnerable consumer? That's the acceptance. So the average consumer idea is the vantage point from which normally practices are assessed. And then there's the exception to the rule, which is the vulnerable consumer. That is a clearly identifiable group of consumers who are particularly vulnerable to the practice or the product because of their mental or physical infirmity, their age, or the way they're likely to believe everything that you tell them. A practice that might be acceptable from the perspective of an average consumer might be unfair when targeted at a vulnerable consumer. That's the idea. Note that writing commercial messages at vulnerable consumers in itself is not unfair, or it does also not translate to extra responsibilities right now. And one of the arguments we made in our study is that this has to change. In the light of the aforementioned profiling strategies, remember contextual targeted strategies, but also psychographic, where you use your psychological constitution to adjust your marketing strategies. In the light of these strategies, we wondered in our study whether this underlying logic of the Unfair Commercial Practice Directive actually still makes sense in the digital age. In the light of this constant monitoring, data-driven optimization and testing, A/B testing to find the most effective measure to persuade us and commercialize our desires, does it still make sense to speak of the average and the vulnerable consumer? And remember that these are the vantage points from which the fairness of practices is being assessed. There has been already quite some critique about the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive's vulnerability concept from various directions, because the concept would be impractical, not sufficiently informed by empirical insights, but also because it's simply unnecessarily stigmatizing, patronizing, and disconnected from reality. As Ryan Calo, a famous American researcher in this area, points out, digital marketing strategies, so the persuasion strategies, data-driven persuasion strategies we just talked about, they tend to collapse the ethical, the legal distinction between the ordinary and the vulnerable consumer, the average and the vulnerable consumer. So essentially he's saying that it's an impractical distinction, but there's a much more fundamental problem with the reigning vulnerability concept, which has been most prominently voiced by the legal theorist and political philosopher Martha Fineman. Fineman argues that being vulnerable is essentially a consequence of human embodiment, of what it means to be human. We all are humans, so we all are vulnerable. Every human is potentially vulnerable to harm, misfortune, injury, or manipulation. No individual can avoid vulnerability. It's part of our human condition. We are. In other words, Fineman's train of ideas regains an entirely new and rather uncanny meaning in the digital market space. That is a space in which human consumers do not engage with other human sellers anymore, but where commercial transactions become a matter of man versus machine, where human consumers may be able to correct persuasion that they encounter in the seller in the shop across, standing across of them. This becomes much, much more difficult vis-a-vis sophisticated A/B testing and data-driven marketing strategies. Strategies that are ultimately used to discover your hidden biases, insecurities, fears, and emotions, and thereby render the consumer vulnerable. The consumer is not vulnerable as the consumer is rendered vulnerable by those strategies. And importantly, renders everybody of us vulnerable. So not only the elderly, infirm and children. With digital marketing practices, the commercial message, the advertising message, is only part of a much larger systemic approach to influence your consumer behavior. And I think that is really important to understand. We're not only talking of a personalized price or personalized commercial message. We are talking of an entire architecture to guide your consumer journey. The message is part of this architecture and can no longer be separated from the technical infrastructure that generates it. Accordingly, to be able to say whether these practices are fair or not, it's not enough to simply look at the message. You need to look at the systemic setup, at the architecture of the digital marketplace, how that shapes this relationship between the consumer and the advertiser. In our report, we explain it in more depth and explore the systemic setup in more detail. And based on that, arrive at a new conception of digital vulnerability. This is a conception of vulnerability that, first of all, acknowledges that the digital vulnerability is the result of certain architectural choices, dark patterns, the way eBay or Booking.com show you how many tickets are left, and so forth. Transactions between digital consumers and sellers take place in these digital choice architectures, we call them, which essentially describe this design of the digital marketplace. And because these choice architectures are data-driven, They can collect your data continuously. They can engage in all this A/B testing and these optimization strategies I mentioned before. So it's essentially an infrastructure to automate the continuous search for exploitable consumer vulnerabilities. And the better these choice architects, by that I mean digital marketplace platforms like Amazon or Bol.com or eBay, the better these choice architects know the consumer, the better they are able to optimize their choices and the more profound the way the relationship between consumer and seller is changing. And that is another important insight. If we talk about vulnerability, this is not an instantaneous moment of vulnerability. Someone sells you something and in that moment you are vulnerable to persuasion. What is happening here is that all these marketplaces and apps that try to sell us things, they're building up a relationship between the seller and the consumer. And the purpose of this relationship is to gather more insight about who you are, what you will buy, and what prices you pay. So digital vulnerability is also relational. And relationships in which major information asymmetries and power asymmetries can exist, as you can mention. And the longer this relationship between a consumer and a digital service or app persists, the more these apps or services can establish positions of power, of persuasion power, as a result of the growing trust that we have into. I mean, think all of you of your relations to your Fitbit or the increased knowledge. And this is power that again then can be used to identify and evoke and exploit vulnerabilities to persuasion. So what does that all mean for law and policy? And it means actually a quite structural way of rethinking unfair commercial practice law. Digital marketplaces that are characterized by these structural power imbalances and choice architectures are explicitly designed to build lasting relationships with consumers, relational, as we just said, and optimize for the potential to exploit individual differences and biases, such as willingnesses to pay different prices. Viewing these developments from a more universal vulnerability perspective teaches us that attempts of empowering users vis-a-vis these platforms or commercial apps are futile. And remember that much of consumer law actually is about consumer empowerment. They are futile as long as regulators do not also tackle these structural architectural power imbalances and inequalities that allow these players to render consumers vulnerable in the first place. And this reconception of consumer vulnerability has important implications also for law and policy, and consumer law in particular. A renewed, more universal perspective of consumer vulnerability means, first of all, that the vulnerable consumer is the norm, not the exception anymore, which also would require a new focus in unfair commercial practice law on identifying and declaring those practices unfair that exploit vulnerability and power asymmetry. So if we're all vulnerable in principle, the real question is not so much whether we're vulnerable or not, but when and under which conditions will digital technologies single us out and abuse our inherent vulnerabilities to make us take decisions that we otherwise wouldn't have taken. In other words, using marketing strategies such as psychographic profiling to render consumers vulnerable is the epitome of an unfair digital commercial practice. And that should be anchored much more explicitly in the regulatory framework of the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, including the provisions on professional diligence, but also on aggressive and misleading practices. Based on this universal vulnerability perspective, we also say that some practices in the digital marketplace are simply unacceptable, exactly because they create or exploit digital vulnerability in a way to make autonomous choices for consumers more difficult. For example, building digital exploitation strategies or architectures that claim to serve non-economic interests, whereas the overall purpose is commercial. Think of health apps and fitness apps that promise you more health and being fitter and happier and more balanced, and so far, which have been essentially built to sell products and not health. Building digital situational monopolies, so situations that actively discourage you from switching to other places, is another example of such an unacceptable practice in our view, which essentially means, remember what I said about the relational decision. Part of what these marketplaces and apps do is to get you know so well and to earn your trust that you're not even thinking of moving to another app. Once Fitbit, always Fitbit. And the third one I would like to mention here is indeed the use of psychographic profiling to exercise emotional or psychological pressure, because this is simply something that even if you inform consumers about them, they will probably not be able to protect themselves sufficiently against that. And with that, I have reached the end of my speech. Thank you for listening.